All right, folks, we do have our guest here with us today, so that's good. But let me give you some of the world's ideas that are going on, and then we'll bring in David Lipsky, and we've also bring in Rick Rosner and other folks that we've got as well. But definitely a lot's going on. I know one thing that's going on is it's hot. It's definitely been some hot weather here and all along those lines. So a lot of people will be talking about the hot weather, and we're definitely in the middle of a heat wave here in Durham, North Carolina. And of course, a lot of people are getting prepared for the debate later on this week between current President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. So that'll be taking place at the end of this week or the latter part of this week. And definitely a lot of people are interested in how this will all play out in the conversations and all along those lines. So definitely a lot of people will be paying attention to that part of the news as well. So a lot of things are going on in that space. And of course, there are the continuing wars that are taking place, and whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Israel or a number of other places as well. So definitely there's a lot of things taken on in the world, and definitely a lot of people are paying attention to the news of the world and what's taking place in that sense and around the world. But we'll get to a couple of these news items, and I'm going to bring in David Lipsky. So I'm going to not go on that detail as I do sometimes in the news, since I do want to get to our guest and see what he's got to say about climate change and even how maybe some of the news items plays into this conversation and all along those lines. So definitely there's a number of things that I'm sure we'll get into conversations about and all along those lines. And we do have, I think Shaquille is with us. I'm not sure where he is doing, because he's oftentimes doing business trips and all in that space, but definitely we'll see what he's got on his mind as well. It looks like a gunman has killed police, priests, and a civilian in attacks on places of worship in Russia's Dagestan. So that is one of the news stories that I am hearing, as well as intense phase of Israel's war with Hamas about to end, according to what Netanyahu has said, and all along those lines. So definitely there's a lot of things that are going on in that space. And of course, like I said, a lot of people are paying attention to what is taking place in terms of what's going to go on with this debate and all in that space. And of course, there are still bitter primary debates. As a matter of fact, there's one going on, bitter primary races, I should say. There's one going on that is featuring Jamal Bowman and all in that space. And of course, a lot of people, if you are into sports, will be paying attention to the NBA draft. And of course, if you're into hockey, folks will see whether a rarity happens, which is in the Stanley Cup. Somebody comes back from 3-0 and all in that space. So Edmonton will be trying to do that this evening, and we'll see whether they have any luck with that or not. And I think the last time that happened was in the early 40s, and that was actually on the home ice. If it's done this time, it will be done on opposition ice. So, and a lot of people are saying that Edmonton has a good chance of doing that, but we'll see if this all plays out or doesn't play out in that sense. But like I said, since I have a guest, I'm going to get to him, and we may come back to some other news items as well. But I'm very fascinated to hear what David Lipsky is all about and all in that space. So how you doing, Mr. Lipsky? I know you've written this amazing book and all in this space, and you oftentimes talk about climate and what's going on with the climate. And I also heard, because my mom was actually one of the first foundations that was created because of tobacco industry, and she was the first president of the Golden Leaf Foundation, which was some of that tobacco settlement money and all in that space. And I do know that you even tie in the alcohol and the cigarette industry in climate change and all in that space. So I'm very fascinated to hear how they are playing into the conversation as well.
Mark, it's great to be in this space. Thanks for inviting us on. Yeah, Durham, you guys are right in the heart of tobacco country. So tell me about the Golden Leaf thing.
The Golden Leaf Foundation, it was, if you remember the tobacco settlement money,
Yeah,
there was
97, 98.
yeah,
Yeah.
several foundations that were created, and mom was the president there for several years, and she was the first president actually of that foundation. And part of the purpose of the foundation was to get people out of the tobacco industry because of some of the uh, very negative things that are around tobacco and everything. So that was part of their goal, was to get people out of that and into other economic kind of growth and all in that space. And like I said,
Um,
mom could probably explain it better than I could.
Mark, why was your mom selected? Was she working with people who had been adversely affected by tobacco, or was
No,
she working? Yeah,
we grew up in Warrenton, North Carolina, so that was part of the PCB dump
yeah.
and all along those lines. And mom, before taking that job, had worked at the Z Smith Reynolds as a program administrator and all along those lines. And she had been very much active in a lot of very much. Both her and my dad had been active in social justice work, and they created one of the first rural radio stations in North Carolina that wasn't college affiliated. The WVSP was created, so they definitely had a lot of ties in that space. And actually, her dad, my granddad, had done some farming. It was not, as far as I know, adversely affected in terms of his
Huh.
health. Definitely, they were very much involved in rural North Carolina. So she's always had a affinity for rural North Carolina.
And Mark, what did Gold Leaf do?
I mean, that what I just said. They were a trust fund that was part of the funding, and
Yeah.
they would give money to different people that would give proposals to around different things. They gave us some money, and actually they ran into some problems. Not ironically, with the Republican Party here in North Carolina, because some of them felt that the programs, whether it was solar energy or whether it was other things, were not necessarily part of their agenda and all along those lines. So I do know that at a time of a similar supermajority to what we have now, the Republican Party and others did not necessarily like some of the projects that were funded, because they were funding projects that were trying to get people out of the industry, but trying to also help them with economic growth.
I would think that anything you did with that money, the tobacco companies couldn't complain about. That is, if it's not blood money, it's like mucus money. It's covered in decades of coughing people and people coughing in hospitals. So I'm shocked that they could complain from their jail cells, like, you shouldn't be spending that money that way. People forget up here that, like Duke University, there was so much money in tobacco that Duke University is a tobacco company's university. It's Duke Tobacco.
Yeah, that's very much true. And actually, I'm a historian for the Hayti Heritage Center, which is a African American cultural arts center here in Durham. And one of the things that we oftentimes talk about, and all along those lines, is when I'm doing my history talks, is if you come into the center, you will see several stained glasses, including two that I'm aware of off the top of my head that are of Jesus Christ. But the most prominent one is actually that of Mr. Duke. So it was actually created, we just celebrated Juneteenth. So it was created actually by Reconstruction slaves that were in the Reconstruction period and all in that space. Because I want to say the first year was created was 1869, even though the physical building wasn't built till 1891. And of course, they did have to go, because even Booker T. Washington talked about the sanest attitude of whites toward African Americans was one that he had seen in that part of North Carolina and all along those lines. So they did reach out to Mr. Duke to get some funding. And he said, yeah, I'll give you some funding. And who knows how much it was at that particular time. But he said, in return for the funding, you've got to put my stained glass at the most prominent plot in the building. So you can only imagine the kind of conversations, even though I had a friend of the family's brother came through yesterday, and somebody asked him whether they had ever really noticed or commented on the fact that he was the most prominent one in terms of the stained glass. He said that, it just became part of the scenery. So I don't think that they really had protested as much as they probably could have protested.
Mark, what's the name of the church again?
It's the St. Joseph's Historic Foundation. It's now the Hayti Heritage Center, but historically it was St. Joseph's. It and White Rock were part of the whole notion of Black Wall Street here in Durham, North Carolina, because there were Tulsas. Even I think you're in the Northeast, and even in around Central Park, those were historical Black Wall Streets as well. So there were a number of historical Black Wall Streets that were thriving African American communities, particularly during Reconstruction. Unfortunately, whether it was through the fire of Tulsa or whether it was through the highway of Durham, sometimes those buildings and communities were destroyed and all along those lines.
That's great. Thanks for that. That's to me, it's such a great way of thinking about North Carolina, that there was a church and there'd be two deities in stained glass. One is our Lord Jesus Christ, and the other is the head of Duke Tobacco. Like that really gets it across.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So tobacco. So the book. The reason I know about tobacco is that the very hot summer that we're having now. What's it like in Durham?
It's very hot here as well. We were sweltering yesterday. We'll be sweltering again today. I think that they're talking about is getting up to 94, 95. There's even some days that might be getting down to 97, and there's definitely some talk of hundreds as well. I know that there's some outside events, and some people may even be reconsidering those outside events, even though historically they are held during this time and everything. But I haven't talked to the organizers to see if they're reconsidering. I know that they'll definitely have mist tents and other things to try to keep people cool if they decide to go forward, which I'm pretty sure that they will.
Because the reason why it's funny to be talking about it in a tobacco state is because the method that we suffered from, that delayed action, it's just the way tobacco delayed action on people smoking and coughing and then starting to die expensively in hospitals. The way to delay people from taking money from the oil companies or having them make less money because you were saying, hey, this product isn't great, that was pioneered by the tobacco companies. And one of the funny reasons that they pioneered it, first they pioneered it because from the 50s, scientists began saying, look, we've had a lot of fun with this product. People started smoking them also in Reconstruction. They got popular after the Civil War. And it's been a tremendously successfully introduced product. You know, more than half of all adults are smoking about like 2/3 of a pack a day. So it's like the dream introduction of any product. I guess cell phones. Probably next to cell phones, next to iPhones, cigarettes had the most successful product launch of anything you could think of. Just everybody carrying around a pack, either a pack of transistors, a pack of chips in their pocket, or a pack of tobacco delivery systems in their pocket. But by the later 40s, the tobacco companies began to understand that smoking was connected to lung cancer. A weird thing, Mark, about lung cancer, one of the first doctors, there were two big doctors who proved basically that cigarettes were connected to cancer. When he was a med student, he was at medical school in St. Louis, and it was 1919. And his the chief surgeon and the guy who's leading the junior class says, "Oh my God, there's somebody who has lung cancer in the hospital. Forget what we're doing for the next 2 days. We should all go visit because you will never see this again as long as you live. That's how rare lung cancer is." And so they all went. And of course, the patient died. That's what happened if you got this incredibly rare thing, lung cancer. And then the same doctor, probably about 15 years later, in the mid-30s, he's working in a hospital. He has become an extremely successful surgeon himself. And there are all these men turning up with lung cancer. And it's a thing that he was told he would never see again as long as he lived. And one of the things that helped tobacco to become even more popular, it became really popular after the Civil War because cigarettes were an easier way to smoke than pipes or cigars. But what made the cigarette completely take off was they were passing them around in World War I. Because that is our first modern war. And what you have are periods of brief and intense activity and then a lot of anxious waiting. And you and I, from our position, Mark, were you ever a smoker?
I was never a smoker. My dad actually smoked pipes at a very young age when I was young, and he's definitely not done that in decades. And I have never been a smoker. I've had friends that are smokers. I have both regular cigarettes as well as I have some friends that are into other kind of smoking activities as well. But there has never been a desire of mine of either type of smoking. I was going to ask you just really quickly because I know we're talking about smoking in definitely North Carolina very much.
No, I'm getting some questions coming in on the chat too.
Yeah, definitely want to get to that too. But one of the questions I have for you, and we'll bring in some of those people that are asking those questions. But also, I know that in your book, you also talk about, and I've had some friends here in Durham that have been very much against the alcohol industry, but you also talk about how alcohol plays into it as well and everything as well. So I just wondered if you could maybe touch on that as well, because even here, there's a gentleman, Minister Paul Scott, that I want to say about a decade or two ago was targeting kind of the liquor companies because the way that they were targeting the African American community and everything. So I actually had the pleasure of having him at an event, ironically at Haytime back on Kwanzaa of last year and everything. And he's still involved in that fight because there are still some people that are saying that the tobacco industry still targets some of our young African American and minority community as well. So just wanted your take on how that plays in.
I'm just laughing at Shaquille's chat, which is don't bring us in, just let me finish this cigarette. The alcohol industry came into this story in a different way, which is, okay, Mark, do you remember that ad from the 70s? The one, it's referred to as the crying Indian ad. We would now say crying Native American or crying member of a First Nation. But the crying Indian ad about littering?
Yes, I do remember that ad.
Can you paint a picture for our viewers?
As I recall it was him in a wilderness setting. I don't remember it as vividly as I could, but it was him in a wilderness setting. I mean, it was kind of in my mind, a take almost on the Marlboro Man, which was kind of the cigarette version of that.
That's really funny, Mark. I never made the connection. He was like the reverse of the Marlboro Man, right?
Right.
So what it was, you'll remember it as I start talking about it. They refer to him as an Indian. There's an Indian and he's in a canoe. And there's like really heavy Indian drum beating, and he looks very stately and dignified. But as he's paddling, he's like hitting like floating coffee cups and like floating newspapers. Right. And you're thinking, oh man, we have to stop like throwing garbage away. Then he pulls the canoe up on like a sort of crappy looking beach. And then the next cut is he's standing near a highway. And if you're standing near a highway, it just is soul killing because there are people going everywhere. You don't know who they are. It looks it's noisy. It smells bad. And so he's looking the way anyone would be looking at a lot of traffic. And then someone just makes it worse by throwing garbage out their window. And it's like a fast food bag, and it falls right at his feet. And it splits open, and there's like French fries and napkins on this poor guy's moccasins. And the camera goes in really tight to his face, and a single manly tear. Do you ever see Glory? That movie Glory? Remember, it was Denzel's first movie, and that's when you knew he'd be a star, when he gets whipped, and just one tear. Like, you think maybe he's really cool and he's not feeling it, but a single tear goes down, and you think, holy God, this guy from St. Elsewhere is going to be a giant star. Anyway, in this ad, a single tear comes out of this Indian's eye. And then this very deep voice, the voice, I don't know if you were a heavy TV watcher. I was once a smoker, and I was also a heavy TV abuser. The voice of the guy who played Cannon, that kind of heavy guy, I think his name was William, I've forgotten his last name. But his voice comes in as deep as a human voice can be, and he says, people start pollution, people can stop it. William Conrad, thanks, Rick. And it was it is one of the most, it's the most popular, most effective PSA, public service ad in history. And it also, that tear is, according to media historians, the most famous visibly shed tear in history. By like 1990, that act of that guy dropping one tear had been seen like 6 or 7 billion times. So it's probably the most famous, the most watched act of crying in our planetary time. It turned out that ad was not designed to make us stop littering and to make us clean up the environment. That ad was being paid for by the beer companies, by Coors and by Budweiser, and by Pepsi and Coke, and by Reynolds because they make aluminum, and by a company called American Can because they didn't want to have to recycle. And so the idea was, think about what that slogan is. That slogan is not, hey, sorry, we made some products that are causing a lot of litter. It's like, it's not corporations start pollution, corporations can stop it. It is people start pollution and people can stop it. What it really means is we're shifting the ball. We've got the medicine ball and it's heavy and it's hard to throw around, and we're going to stick you with it. So that's
just really quickly along those same lines, one of the most famous ads, and I remember that one as well. And I'm thinking, I don't know this for a fact, but maybe you can shed some light on it. But one of the other most famous ads during that era, and even used to this day, is the one of Smokey the Bear. So I'm wondering how much is Smokey the Bear actually paid for and bought for by some of the corporations as well, because that is one of the probably most famous ads that has been out there for a number of years. That and the owl, whose name is slipping
Yeah,
me. You think
I think that's Hootie the Owl. No, Smokey the Bear was paid for by just United Bears, and what they found was that when there was smoke around, when there were fires, it was harder to eat deer and camp. I'm just kidding. No, Smokey the Bear was paid for by the U.S. Park Service, and in a way, it made us trust. But think how careful you have to be about, like, it seems like you have an opinion in your mind, and it seems like David, thought of this. And then when you look at it, you find the fingerprints from all these experts. It's like we wanted David and all the other Davids and all the other Marks and all the Ricks and all the Shaquilles. We wanted all of them to have this opinion. And it turns out it's full of expert fingerprints. Like when I was a kid, I saw that ad and I was inspired, and I was telling my parents, don't depend on the corporations. Let's do something ourselves to fight pollution. And that was an idea that these people had paid tens of millions of dollars to put in the brains of all the people like us. And the idea was, don't go to Congress and say these companies polluted, make them pay for it. It's like, get your parents to get one of those little stabby things and they can pick up the cans themselves. And so that's how alcohol came in. With cigarettes. So these guys, like when they went to the front, the general who was leading our troops, whose name was Blackjack, and I've forgotten his name, Rick Rosner. Look up, Blackjack Pershing. Okay, just asking Rick made me remember. But what he said is, to win this war, we need cigarettes as much as bullets, because cigarettes were both calming and they also kind of kept you on your toes. So all these Americans who'd gone to fight in the war, they all came back smoking cigarettes. And so that's why lung cancer that's why lung cancer started appearing in the 30s, because you had a whole generation of American men who were being given cigarettes for free while they were in those trench lines. And then they started dying. So the cigarette companies knew that their product was murderous by the late 40s. And then by the mid 50s, all of a sudden Reader's Digest and Time Magazine are writing articles saying things like cancer by the carton. And in Reader's Digest, that was the #1 magazine in the world then. The last couple of words were just the last ones you want to read if you have a product. It was alert the public. Wow. And so what they came up with was 2 ways to fight. And you know this from your personal life too. Exactly, Shaquille. If someone is coming at you and I learned this, I reported for a long time on the Army. Mark, do you have any friends who are in the Army? Were you ever, you never?
I did not serve myself, but I have a cousin that was in the Army. He was actually made it up to, I think, Lieutenant Colonel, and is now actually ironically working on warp technology and some other things as a civilian business person and everything. But definitely and he was only one of several relatives and friends that have served in various aspects of the military. But yeah, definitely Emmett was in the Army.
There's a great thing you learn in the Army, which is when someone insults you, you don't defend it. You just incorporate the insult and chuckle about it and then act on it. So like Mark, I'm Jewish. And so friends of mine there, like friends of mine who were Filipino or who were Catholic, they would start singing the dreidel song, which is a song that Jews are supposed to sing during our Kwanzaa thing, during Hanukkah. Right. And so, your first impulse is to get angry or stuffy. And it's just like, you know what, I'll just roll with it, because that's how people in green do it. And it's sort of like they're testing you out, right? You just chuck and you say, yeah, I'll show you how to make a dreidel, and we'll do some gambling on the dreidel. Now let's police the area.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Before I bring in the other people, there was another aspect of what you talk about, and it's another major industry. Ironically, it has a Durham connection as well, because BC powder was discovered here and everything. And a lot of times, even during the pandemic, we saw a lot of people that were having headaches and running to their whole notion of trying to cure the headache and everything. And definitely aspirin was part of the conversation. And that seems like aspirin is part of your conversation with climate change. So I was just wondering where aspirin plays in this conversation.
Okay, so Mark, like when we were kids, and Jatovi or Rick, do you guys, like, you probably are younger than I am, but when I was a kid, you just took aspirin. That was the only pain reliever. And so the question was, which brand? Was it going to be the supermarket brand, or was it going to be Bayer aspirin? Right. Bayer was the buffered aspirin, whatever that meant. And then now there's Advil, there's Tylenol, there's Motrin, there's a number of different pain relievers. And part of what happened was, and this is super interesting about how corporations work, it's just for whatever reason, when you bring them data that their product is dangerous, rather than saying, oh, we got to change it, the first thing they do is they say, who are you to tell us that? And maybe you're wrong. So in the late 70s, there was a very rare but terrifying medical condition called Ray's syndrome.
Mhm.
And what's awful about it is it happened to your kid. So let's say your kid has a fever, and this only happened if it was a virus, or if it was like the flu or chickenpox. You look on the label of aspirin and it says for relief of symptoms of the flu. So you gave it to your kid. This only happened to people who are under the age 18. And in a very small number of cases, they would start vomiting, they'd fall into a coma, and then they would die. And it was happening to something like 700 to 1,000 people a year. But if that's your kid, like that's the determining event of your life. Mm-hmm. So thousands of kids had died, and the some pediatric doctors, they looked into it. There were 4 studies, and it turned out that it was related to taking aspirin. And so what they went to the FDA, and the FDA then went to the Office of Budget and Management, and they said, hey, just get the aspirin companies to put a label on, because 1,000 people a year are going to lose a kid. And the aspirin companies did exactly what the Coke and beer companies did about recycling, and what the cigarette companies did about lung cancer. They fought it. They said, who are you to say this is happening? It's probably wrong. What are your motives? And they fought it for 10 years. And for 10 years, people kept dying. And then finally, when the New England Journal of Medicine had a definitive study 10 years later, the government just said, look, you've got to put a warning label on. And the number of cases went from 1,000 to 34 to 2. Like, there was no question that's what was causing it. But in the interim, all these people had died, lost their kids. And that's why people still don't trust aspirin. That was why Tylenol and Advil came in, because people understood that there was something wrong with aspirin. And if the aspirin companies had just said, oh, thank you for telling us, Pediatrics Union, we will put this label on in 1979, you would have had, I think, about 4,000 or 5,000 kids. It was someone did like one of those actuarial things, how many people were lost to it. So hurt the trust in the product, and then it ruined lives. But that's where aspirin
before I
comes
get
in.
to the panels and get them in and everything, because I did see they had some interesting comments, including Rick Rosner talking about the bottle recyclable campaign, and 3% of bottles are recycled, and that's not a tremendous amount and everything. But you also, because we have a show that sometimes airs on this network that comes out of Malaysia, and I know that he oftentimes talks about Tesla and some of the other founders, and I know that part of your book and part of your research shows that some of these leaders were actually part of the early climate pioneers, if I can use that terminology and everything. And I noticed you talk about that. And I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about that, and then I'll bring in some of the panelists, and I'm sure they've got some questions based on what we've been talking about.
So one of the funny things about Tesla is Tesla understood that we were going to have energy shortages. So Tesla and Edison, the way the book that Mark and I are talking about, it's a book that I wrote, and it's called The Parrot and the Igloo. If someone asks, I can give like a 2.5-minute explanation of why it's called that, but I'm just as happy not. It depends on what you guys want me to do. But what the story is we have this thing where our weather is getting worse, where it's bad. It's one of those things, Mark, where you kind of forget about it by November and December. Like, there will be some kind of a natural disaster where you'll be like, oh yeah, that's that climate thing. And then it really swings around. And then by June, you're like, why didn't we do anything about this? And from June to September, you think about it. And then, being the kind of creatures we are, then by October, we sort of forget again. That issue is an outgrowth. It was an unavoidable outgrowth of the great fact that we have all this electricity, and that we have cars and airplanes, but mostly the electricity part. And so the book begins when Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla were there figuring out this incredibly exciting way to use electricity, which is to pipe it into everyone's home. and then to build power plants that will make the electricity that you can pipe into people's home. And this was what was important to Edison. This is why he did it. You could charge them for the electricity. What was really interesting about Tesla is at the same time that he was perfecting the way that you could send electricity across 24 miles, 100 miles, 500 miles, that was something that was thrilling to people. Before, no one had ever sent it more than like a couple of 100 feet. At the same time that he was working that out, he also was saying, look, I can see forward to a time when we'll be running out of gas and running out of coal. So yeah, he was one of the first people who understood the limits to the way we use energy.
Gotcha. And as I bring in Rick and Shaquille and Sasha, and maybe Jatovia will join us as well. Also, Nick, one of the founders of the network. And I see that Lee Rhodes is in the background and everything. But you also talked, and you kind of alluded to it, about the automobile industry. And a lot of times when people think about pollution and climate change, the automobile industry is one of the lead culprits. I know a lot of people get excited, and some people
Yeah, although with
don't
yeah, now transportation is
get
generating
excited about the whole notion of EVs and all along those lines. So I just wanted your take.
Oh, sorry, I lost the first part. But with EVs, the thing about EVs, they don't combust fossil fuels, but they do because they don't combust it in their engines. But to get the electricity, they do have to combust fossil fuels on the production end upstream for the electricity, so that they are not. They're a great solution down the road when we have a cleaner way of generating electricity. But still, a good amount of our electricity is generated by fossil fuels, by compressed dinosaurs and flower petals. But that is, we have ambitious targets. Now I'm sounding like a newscaster. They want to switch us over to electric vehicles, and that's probably a good idea. Rick, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, so could you talk about, there's some crazy bad news and some crazy good news. The bad news is, well, the good news is the per capita carbon footprint of Americans goes down by about 1% a year because we go fewer places. You know, we can work from home, and technology makes things more efficient. But on the other hand, AI and blockchain are like consuming a huge amount of electricity for nonsense, you know, so we can have endless porn, for instance.
How is that nonsense? Endless porn. I reject your assumption. Endless porn, nonsense. This nation and
we
its
already
many,
have a billion images.
No, but this nation and its many unsuccessful marriages and couplings, this nation runs on porn. You turn off. There was a thing that the cigarette industry said. They would warn this in the Times when the Times would come to them and say, you've got to stop selling this. What they would say is, you better have something to replace cigarettes, or they'll shoot up their places of business. They'll beat their wives. Search Philip Morris and beat their wife. Like, that was one of the ways that their sort of threats about, don't take this product away. It will drive people crazy. And they would say it every 5 or 10 years in interviews. Similarly, you take away porn from this country, I think it would be fascinating to see what happens. But Rick, so it's a very complicated thing. And here's what I've noticed, and I think it does not help. You guys tell me your experience. Generally, the kinds of people that we don't like socially. James Carville, who I've always thought is kind of a hero because he helped get President Clinton elected. And Shaquille, this country was going in a very bad, super bad direction before the Democrats came back in 92, 93. Carville said that the kinds of people you don't like, you don't want them sitting next to you on a car trip, that they have gotten the microphone in ways that are bad for progressive politics and democratic politics in America. I don't know if it's the case in Australia. Rick, I don't know who you know, but in general, the kinds of people who talk about this issue, they are often not the great people who do the climate science work and not the great people who work at like the NRDC, but the people who are like freelancers for them. They're not the people you want to find yourself next to on a Starbucks line if you go into Starbucks, or are talking about their time on a Starbucks line on the sidewalk. And so, for example, we had one of the first drops in our emissions last year. We used to, Mark, we were talking about how coal generates our electricity. It used to. And so more than 51% of our electricity was generated by coal by like 2007, 2006. And that's terrible because coal causes the most temperature pollution. coal causes the most global warming. And now, wonderfully, in America, only 19% of our energy, only 19% of our electricity is coming from coal. Do you know why that's the case, Rick?
No, I know there are
No.
only
Okay, just no. Just
15,000.
just stop with no. The reason why is because of fracking. Now, it is such a complicated, ironic issue, right? Like everybody I know, me included, I wanted to go out and say, where do we come off squeezing water into, into hairline fractures in the ground to get to natural gas? Who knows what it's doing to the water table? Who knows what it's doing to the creatures that live there? It probably is bad. And yet it turns out the best thing that we've done for climate in this country is fracking. But most of those people who Carville was saying, they're the kinds of people you don't want on a car trip. They're the people whom we associate socially with the issue. And they're the ones who would say we have to stop fracking.
Hey, David,
Super
just really quick,
complicated
I have to
issue.
teach you, and I saw some other people had questions as well, but I did
Sure.
notice, and I've been noticing it for a while, and it was a thing that has been going on for a while, whether it is the scooter type or the bicycle. So I was just wondering, as a climate change advocate and everything, do you think more of us need to be doing bicycling? Because I did notice the bicycle in the back of your setting along those lines. So I'm just wondering, I do know that there have been a number of people, even here in Durham, that have tried to deal with those scooters. Sometimes they are hard to manipulate and hard to maneuver. I know I ran into a gentleman who was trying to get on one and couldn't figure out how to get on one and all in that space. But I'm just wondering your take on whether this is something that we need to do more of, bicycling and walking and all along those lines from a climate perspective.
Sure, I want to hear from Shaquille too, just because he's been smiling. Yeah, those things are great. It was weird. Do you remember when the Segway came out? When the Segway came out, they had all these celebrity angel investors like Steve Jobs and I think Spielberg, and they thought it was going to transform the cities. And they also thought that it would be good for climate because it's electricity. The trouble, and obviously I should be biking more just because I'm a little fat right now, and biking is extremely fun. If we were all biking, that would be great. Scooters run on electricity. Electricity is still, by and large, in this country, mostly generated by fossil fuels. Here's the weird thing, and here's what I think is hard for people. Tell me what your experience is with the people that you know. You're turning on TV, Rick, and turning on TV is one of those great Midwesternisms, even though I'm from New York. But you turn on the television, and people are saying, forget the wars, forget COVID. The biggest threat to the world, and it's been the biggest threat for a while, is global climate change. And you nod, you're like, yeah, that's the biggest problem in the world, right? Have we all heard that?
Yeah.
Okay, Rick, I mean, pretty much, like whenever someone is trying to seem solemn and serious, that's what they'll say. But when people were saying that COVID was an immediate threat, within 2 or 3 weeks, once they made that determination, we were all masked up and we were all living indoors, and we changed our manner of life willingly, happily. That's one of the great things about modern people. They will work together communally in ways that actually are sort of foreign to earlier centuries. We saw that in World War II. We saw it in civil rights. Here, I'm just talking about America now, Shaquille, so I'm leaving you out. But Americans are great at that when you ask them to do it. But for all the times that we've heard people say this is the biggest possible threat, this is the biggest threat we've ever faced, the climate scientists who brought that threat to us, they will often suggest the solution. Jatovi, do you know what the solution is that the climate scientists advocate?
No, I don't. What is it?
Nuclear power. Like,
Yes.
they are scientists. Exactly, Rick, yes. Like, nuclear power generates no carbon dioxide. And so, Mark, with nuclear power generating our electricity, those scooters would be great. No other cars.
However, there's a new book out by Annie Jacobson that is kind of a companion book to yours, because your book, The Parrot and the Igloo, highly researched. Decades of research have gone into your book. She researched her ass off on nuclear war and found out that all the protections we think we have in place are bullshit, and that is hanging over us. And yeah, I love nuclear power, but in her nonfiction book, she talks about, like, if North Korea, the crazy guy, Kim Jong-un, drops a bomb on Diablo Canyon, California's nuclear reactors were screwed, and that may just end up like I love nuclear power, but
Rick, along those
liberals
same
are
lines, and this
afraid
is
of
No,
back
I
to
think that's
David.
it. You have to
This is
deal with the waste.
Yeah, this is back to David. That's what I was going to ask you about the waste, because one of the
Well,
complaints about nuclear power is what happened in upstate New York. I think it was Thousand Island or something like that, and everything. And
no,
even here,
Green Island.
Thousand Island is a really great dressing.
dressing, right? But you know what I'm saying, right?
Let's not bring calumny to a really good covering for romaine lettuce and tomato.
Right.
No, it's 3 Mile Island. It was in
3 Mile
Pennsylvania.
Island.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, yeah.
3 Mile Island. And but also what happened with because even sometimes people in North Carolina will complain as to where the nuclear power plant is located
Yeah.
and all in that
No.
space. So I was just wondering your take on
Okay, it's
that, 'cause
super.
that is one of the complaints about nuclear power.
Mark, it's super bad luck, but I see Jatovi has his hand up while he's driving, and so if someone driving, you got to call on them. So Jatovi, let's hear it.
well, I was actually I parked because I'd gotten to my destination, and it's a very interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And then the fun part, you guys started talking about nuclear power, and that's the fun, interesting thing because I watched a podcast by Kyle Hill. He just visited Germany, where they're turning off the last glass nuclear power setup, and that's getting turned off, I think, this year. And that's happening in Germany. However, my big question, because with the advancement of technology right now, they're pushing into nuclear fission, which actually has less waste than nuclear fusion, which is what's being used currently.
Jatovi, it's the reverse, but absolutely.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So with now Bill Gates investing a lot of money into the whole nuclear side of things, I don't know if Bill is going to the nuclear fusion side with the less waste or the nuclear fission side with the more waste. So whichever side he lands on, I think may get the more push, but I could be wrong. And I would love to hear your opinion on that.
I was talking to some people about Mr. Gates stepping into that realm a couple of weeks ago. It's super exciting. He is stepping in. He's still working with fission. Fusion is how the sun works. The sun is an ongoing. So Mark, if you look up and everything on the planet, including our regular normal pleasant temperature, our average temperature used to be about 59 degrees. Now I think it's like 60.5 degrees. That is the average temperature year round. All of the energy, including, if you think about it, the fossils that are in the fossil world of fossil fuel, all of that comes from the sun, inevitably. The sun is one ongoing fusion reaction at all times. By the way, there's a great, I always love terms of art. There's a great term of art for when a nuclear power plant goes online. That phrase is going critical. So once you get the reaction going, the phrase you'd use is going critical. So that Indian Point, which is the nuclear power plant near Manhattan, I think that went critical in like 64 or 65. The sun went critical about 5 billion years ago. So we've been trying to replicate the thing, which is the basic energy source for everything. I just killed a mosquito and I felt slightly guilty about it, but its energy source is the sun too, basically the sun and my blood, although I stopped it in time. Fission is how the nuclear power plants work. And Mr. Gates, Bill Gates, has been looking at all the scientists who keep running op-eds saying, look, there is an available solution. And so he is looking at ways to make nuclear power plants smaller and safer. But another way of looking at it is, and yeah, Mark, I often wonder, or I don't want to pry, but I'm a person of faith. I am an irregular attendant at places of worship, but all of us deep down in our ways are people of faith, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty much so spiritual. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily overly religious. Don't necessarily go to church all the time, but definitely I'm a believer in a higher power. And as I've said on this show and other shows, I'm definitely a believer in the connection to the ancestors, which a lot of folks of different ethnicities are believers in as well. So
Mark, the basic religion in Japan, Shinto, is sort of like half of it is ancestor worship. So that is a strong component in the human desire to believe. But I'm curious, I know this is super personal, but on some level, you're in the shower or you're driving and there's some bad luck or potential bad luck afflicting your family. I'm just curious, actually, don't most of us have a sense, like you can feel it in your body almost, that there might be something we're connected to, some larger power? I'm just curious because we're all at a party.
Yeah, I
Nick, we
definitely feel
happen to
that.
be at a party. So one of the things that I've gotten a sense of doing this research is that higher power clearly does not want there to be a solution to climate change, because the terrible luck that this issue has experienced, it is such monstrously bad luck. It's like it would be like it would be like Inspector Clouseau, you know, the guy from the Pink Panther, trying to take the subway home and then take his coat off and make himself coffee. The tremendously bad luck we know he would experience, Shaquille, is the kind of bad luck this issue has had. So Rick, before I throw back to you, by the late 70s, the National Academy of Science and the Jasons, those are two really powerful collections of physicists that advise the government. They came to the president and they said, "This is going to happen." That might have been a time when we would have turned towards nuclear in a more serious way. That's the same year that there was the averted meltdown at 3 Mile Island. And that is a little bit like what we were talking about with aspirin. That made 2 generations of people nervous about this without being able to remember. Now, Mark, we think of it as like Thousand Islands because we don't keep hearing it that much. Same thing with aspirin. And so, but Rick, before I throw to you, France doesn't have a lot of coal, doesn't have a lot of natural gas, doesn't have a lot of oil, but it has a great deal of electricity. Do you know where they get their electricity from?
40% from nukes.
No, 80% from nukes.
But aren't you guys all missing the boat? I mean, the thing is, every time I hear climate change, I go, all the climatists are missing the boat completely, because it's always this alarmist. It's the biggest threat to national security. It's the biggest threat, but it's not. Here's the biggest threat to national security, which none of you writers write about. It's the national debt. The United States is like 35 trillion in the hole, and nobody in the media understands how bad it really is here. Social Security goes broke next decade, Medicare goes broke this decade, and the United States is broke to begin with. But for some reason, everybody in media writes about climate change, which I grew up in Florida. Okay, it's going to get a little hotter in the next 100 years, big deal. But during your lifetime, David, you are going to go broke in the end. The United States is going to lose its superpower status. Wouldn't that be something that's immediate, that you can actually do something about, that you guys would write about, as opposed to throwing climate change out there every 5 seconds? You can't even control it. India and China.
I'm thrilled by what Nick said, and I would love to talk about that, but I can't see the name of the gentleman in the blue shirt with his
Sasha. Sasha's over there.
Yes, Sasha hasn't spoken yet. So Nick, I'm thrilled. I couldn't be more thrilled by what you said, but gotta throw to Sasha. So Sasha.
Hello. I don't think that national debt of the United States, I live in Canada, but however, I'm following U.S. politics and business and so on, and I don't think it's the biggest threat, because Donald Trump will become president in 4 months, and he will completely eliminate all the national debt of the United States. So that's not really a big threat. Now, speaking about the global warming, I live in Toronto, Canada, and thanks to global warming, our climate became so much better. It's now, the winter is much warmer than ever before, and I don't think that I'm alone in that respect. I think that many, probably Scandinavian countries in Europe or so on, the global warming is not such a big threat either. Now, speaking about the use of nuclear energy, yes, of course, this is by far the best solution. And I'm aware, I'm getting a lot of financial publications, all the cheap stuff that they're saying, oh, Bill Gates invested in this, and what's his name?
Elon Musk?
Tesla, Elon Musk invested in that, or so on. And then at the end of the publication, you have to buy their advice for $9 a month or something. So speaking about all that stuff, before going into spam, I just read the name of what they're suggesting. A couple of times in case of curiosity, I already know who will ask for $9 a month and who will ask $39 a month or so. I'm just checking myself as I'm right or not. So what's interesting is that, yes, nuclear is definitely the case. And from what I've heard, including this $9 a month financial publications, that they do invest, but what they're trying to do is super clean and super safe nuclear reactors. So it will be like state of the art. They're already quite sophisticated, especially the latest model, but working on even more efficient and more safe.
Rick, okay, go ahead, Rick. But then I want to address what Nick said.
One is,
and Sasha, that was great. Thank you.
Are the new reactors really that clean? And two, people are having less sex, making fewer babies. There's a big population decline. So now experts are predicting we won't hit peak planetary humanity. Instead of 11 billion in the year 2100, we're going to peak at 9.5 billion in 2060. I read that and I thought, holy shit, we're saved. We're going to have some tough decades. But if humanity peaks and then starts going down, will that save us from some of the more horrible effects of climate change?
Rick, that's a great question, but I want to get back to what Nick said and also what Sasha was saying. Probably take about 5 minutes. But yeah, Rick, one of the reasons, so the people by the 50s, we understood. So Nick, climate change. Okay, well, let me begin by addressing the funny thing Sasha said, and it will then answer what Rick was saying. So weirdly enough, the science of this goes back to, it's always been mainstream science. One of the smart ways that people found of making it seem not serious is by suggesting it was like weird fringe people. But the basic theory about carbon dioxide driven global warming goes back to the nation leading mainstream scientists of the 19th century. John Tyndall, who was the lead scientist in the 1850s, 1860s in Britain, he was curious what makes the sun's rays, what makes the heat that they generate by hitting the ground, what makes it stay? Clearly something in the air. He figured out that it was water vapor and carbon dioxide. In the 1890s, Sweden's leading chemist, by the time he died, the New York Times in his obit, actually before his obit, referred to him as probably the most famous chemist alive. He won the Nobel Prize, Sweden's first Nobel Prize winner, and then he directed the Nobel Labs. You cannot be more mainstream than that. He is the person who worked out that we could actually warm the climate because of our use of coal, because of the carbon dioxide and coal smoke, that we could warm it. We could, if we doubled our use, we would raise the temperature by between 4 and about 10%. He thought that would happen in 2 or 3 centuries. Sasha, this is where it responds to what you were saying. Mm-hmm. And the scientist who said that, his name was Svante, difficult name to pronounce, Arrhenius. His friends were also, one of them also became a Nobel laureate, but they were, lauded, medal-wearing scientists. They were in Sweden. They were all really happy because Sweden's cold. So they were like, that's really good news. And they were like, why wait? There are some coal mines around here that they've gotten most of the coal out. What we should do is we should have the government buy these old coal mines and then set them on fire because there's still trace amounts. They can pump out smoke round the clock, and that will make things warm up faster. So a lot of the man who basically developed the notion that gave us the first real solid data that we were going to have carbon dioxide warming the climate, his sense was that it was positive, just what Sasha was saying. It turns out, once we began examining it in our era, and you can, I would start our era around the middle 50s, sometime after that last big Greece versus Troy style war that we had, and probably the last big war that we'll have like that. They began seeing it differently. And what they had begun to understand by the 50s, 60s, and 70s is that we are in a very strange, difficult, tricky balance. So, for example, the gray heads like myself and Mark, I don't want to, so I'll call myself a gray head. The gray heads like me, we remember the ozone crisis in the 80s. Anyone here remember? And Nick, this is my way of working my way to your great point. So what happened with the ozone layer? Mark, since this is your show, do you have a good memory of the ozone thing?
I remember the ozone crisis. I remember a lot of conversations around aerosol cans.
Exactly. So we had I was surprised when aerosol cans came back. Javoti, you would spray under your arm. It made you feel great. As opposed to having to rub some crap under there, which we're doing now, you would just spray. I don't even have to touch it. And similarly, women would spray their hairs with hairspray, thus giving John Waters his first mainstream cinematic hit. But it turned out that the stuff that they were using to propel that was Freon. It was chlorofluorocarbons. And those were, they're basically what we use in the AC and in refrigerators. They were synthesized in the late 20s. People were very excited. They were synthesized to make refrigerators work. And then they found all these other uses. Scientists, they're looking for a job sometimes. So when a scientist, Rick, when they're reading the newspaper, they're just looking for, like, what can I do an experiment on that might end up leading to a grant and then leading to people talking about me more. Highly competitive people. They want to prove how sharp they are. And so a scientist named Sherwood Rowland at Irvine, he was reading about how successful spray cans were. And he just asked himself the question that scientists always ask. Okay, this is a new factor. What's it going to lead to? The propellant, the CFCs, they're going out of the cans. Some of them are making us stink less, but then they're going up into the air. What's happening to them? And so he got a laser physicist, and they began working it out, and they worked it out really quickly. It took about 3 weeks just doing math and examining components in the atmosphere. First 3 weeks were boring, and then the last couple of days were terrifying. It turned out that when they drifted up to the ozone layer, so the ozone layer is just Javotti. It is just like SPF 100 for everybody on the planet. It protects us from UV light. It protects us, from the infrared and the UV both. And so it stops us from getting skin cancer. It's just, we evolved for there to be a certain amount, I think about 6 parts per million of ozone in our atmosphere. It turned out that those chemicals, the CFCs that were mostly manufactured by DuPont, each one of those molecules would kill between 10,000 and 100,000 molecules of ozone. So that was terrible news. So Molina and Sherwood Rowland, they were the scientists who had found this out in '74. Press conferences, they are speaking at the annual meeting of the American Chemical Society. They were being interviewed. They're in the Times and Time magazine. DuPont does what the cigarette companies did, what the beverage and packaging industry did, what fossil fuels did. They say, we need more research. Why should we trust you? And so it is a 13-year fight. And what Rowland keeps saying, he became the public face of this research. Molina, he shared the Nobel Prize with him, but Molina gets less of the knockus, what we would say in my Jewish tradition. He gets less of the knockus than Rowland gets for it. Anyway, there was no action. And then a British survey company at the tip of South America, they began noticing that there was a giant hole in the ozone layer. The hole was larger than Antarctica. The hole was so large you could see it from Mars. The hole was so unprecedented that they had been recording it for a few years. A US satellite called Nimbus 7 had been recording the fact that there was a tremendous loss of ozone in this one section. That's, again, Antarctica is the biggest continent, so a huge loss. But the computer had been programmed, Mark, to throw out data that seemed like it couldn't possibly be true. So for years it had been saying, okay, this data is garbage, we have to erase it. And so when they went back, they saw that they had been recording it for about 3 or 4 years. Right when they saw the ozone hole, it took just 2 years, from 87 to 89, to get together a binding international protocol called the Montreal Protocol that led to the abolition of chlorofluorocarbons. It turned out it was fairly easy to find other refrigerants. But the weird thing, the scary thing, and Nick, and then I'm going to go to the debt part, but that is what, and Sasha, that also is what makes this a tricky problem. We are in a careful balance. The scientists knew that this product was eating up ozone, but they didn't know that the way things interdepend. It's a little bit like if you sprain your ankle, you could end up with like a neck pain because you're walking in a funny way. The Earth is one big united system, so that when you were eating up ozone in that way, the way it accelerated was we had a giant hole. They don't actually know. For example, the greater incidence of once in a century weather events, nobody predicted exactly that. So that's what they're worried about, aside from the fact that if you raise the temperature 3 or 4 degrees, it becomes very bad for A, certain crops that we grow, and then B, the cities and most human cities are near some kind of water. That's one of the reasons the cities are there, that you then begin to change population patterns. But then, Nick, the last thing, which to me is funny, and then Sasha, it's all yours. This is going to take about another 90 seconds. The weird thing for me, Nick, is that as a scientific issue and as a political issue, climate change, global warming, climate change is a fake phrase that was invented by a brilliant Republican pollster named Frank Luntz to make it seem a little bit less scary. Nick, he's the one who took estate tax and turned it into death tax and then was able to get it lowered. So he's a genius. Anyway, weirdly, global warming became mature as a political issue and as a science issue in '79, about the same year that President Reagan ran on the debt. And you know, so Mark, federal deficit is how much more we spend every year than how much we take in. The debt is how many IOUs we've passed over the years that we're going to have to pay out eventually with T-bills, with treasury bonds.
We're actually out of time, so we're going to have to go. Next program.
Come on another show.
David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, will be joining us on our next show. So thank David. We're going to have to bring you back on this one, and we'll see you tomorrow on World Edition.
We'll have you back whenever you're ready.